The story number 1, The Watcher in the Shadows. Working the night shift at a corporate office in Raleigh, North Carolina was never my first choice, but it was the only schedule that fit my classes. Most nights the building was eerily quiet, with only the flickering fluorescent lights illuminating the vast, empty space around me. It was unsettling, yes, but at the same time the solitude offered a strange sense of peace. I could concentrate without the usual distractions and get a lot of work done. However, one Friday night changed everything. It was around 2 a.m. as I sat at my desk, fingers flying over the keyboard, when I was jolted by a sudden sound. It was just a crack, something that could have easily come from the settling walls of the building, but the eeriness of the night made my heart race. I brushed it off and focused on my work again, but moments later, I was startled again, this time by the unmistakable sound of a computer booting up from the other side of the room. Frowning in confusion, I stood on my chair, straining to peer over the cubicle walls. There, in the far corner, the glow of a computer screen illuminated a vacant cubicle, the eerie blue light casting long shadows. My instincts screamed that I was alone in this building, and I felt an unsettling chill creep over me. Against my better judgment, I called out, "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed in the stillness. The glow from the computer flickered and then abruptly went dark. An uneasy knot formed in my stomach. Deciding to stay hidden, I turned off my own desk lamp and computer. I crouched low, tiptoeing cautiously toward the cubicle where the light had been. The building was silent again, but my heart pounded loudly in my chest. I waited for what felt like an eternity, hoping it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Finally, I worked up the courage to venture closer, moving silently toward the exit. As I reached the opening near the elevators, my eyes caught something in the corner. There was a man, crouched low behind a potted plant. Dressed in black, he seemed to be watching me, though he hadn't yet noticed I was there. I froze, dread washing over me like ice water. I quickly turned back to the stairwell. There was no way I was waiting for the elevator now. I opened the stairwell door slowly, praying it wouldn't creak, and stepped inside, shutting it quietly behind me. Just as I began to descend the stairs, I heard the door above me burst open, followed by the sound of frantic footsteps racing down after me. Adrenaline surged through me, and I bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my throat. Each thud of my feet echoed as I flew down the flights, the footsteps behind me growing louder and more erratic. I finally reached the ground floor, sprinting through the lobby and out the front doors. I glanced back but saw no sign of the man. Panting and shaken, I called the police and one of my bosses, who confirmed that I was the only one scheduled for the night. The police arrived within minutes, scouring the building from top to bottom, but they found nothing. I couldn't provide them with a detailed description beyond a man in all black. For the following week, my boss allowed me to lock all entrances to the office floor, including the elevators. But I still felt that gnawing sense of unease, as if he was lurking just out of sight, watching me. Each creak of the building, every flicker of the lights, set my nerves on edge. I eventually transitioned to daytime shifts, forever changed by that encounter. The fear of what might have happened that night still lingers in my mind. I wonder if he was just passing through, or if he had sinister intentions. I no longer work nights, but the memory of that man in the shadows continues to haunt me. A chilling reminder that sometimes the quietest places hold the darkest secrets. The story number 2, Midnight Intruder. It was around 4 a.m. on a Saturday night when I was jolted awake by the grumbling of my stomach. The late-night snack I had been dreaming of seemed impossible to ignore. With a sigh, I threw off the covers and padded into the kitchen to whip up a quick sandwich. As I entered the dimly lit room, I immediately noticed something was off. One of the cabinets was ajar. Now, I'm meticulous about closing everything after I use it. It's just part of my nature. I stared at the open cabinet, puzzled. Why would I have left it open? A slight chill ran down my spine, and curiosity turned into concern. I ventured through the house, checking closets and corners, half expecting to find an unwanted guest. Everything appeared normal until I stepped into the den. My heart sank as I saw the back door wide open. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. Someone had definitely been inside my house. I hesitated, then forced myself to step outside. The night air was crisp, and I flipped on the patio light, squinting into the darkness. That's when I saw him, a figure slouched in one of the patio chairs. He looked filthy, like he had been living on the streets for months. His long, tangled hair fell around his shoulders, obscuring his face. He stared at me with a blank expression, and for a moment, I couldn't move. What did he want? Slowly, he stood up and began to walk toward me. My mind raced, weighing my options. He didn't seem immediately threatening, but something deep down told me to run. Panic surged through me, and I managed to slam the door shut just as he lunged forward. I locked it, my heart pounding in my chest as we stared at each other through the glass. In that tense moment, I realized I needed to call the cops. I sprinted to the kitchen, fumbling for my phone as adrenaline coursed through me. But when I returned to the den, he was already gone. The patio was empty, but the gnawing feeling in my gut told me he hadn't left far. I called the police and explained the situation, but they found no trace of the intruder. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, jumping at every sound. The eerie encounter left me shaken, and even after the police left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Weeks later, the memory still haunted me. Who was he? What were his intentions? I never found out, but I learned to trust my instincts. I now double-check every door and window before bed, ensuring my sanctuary remains just that, my sanctuary. The story number 3, beneath the surface. A few months ago, I experienced something that still sends chills down my spine. I live in a quiet suburb, a place where everyone knows their neighbors and doors are rarely locked. But that all changed for me one dark February night. I have a charging outlet under my bed, which I often use to keep my phone charged. Each night, I would place my phone on the ledge above my bed, using it as my alarm. It was a routine that I relied on until one fateful Monday night when everything changed. I was jolted awake by the sound of my phone's alarm blasting through the darkness. Confused, I glanced at my desk clock, which read 4 a.m. I felt a wave of disorientation wash over me. Had I accidentally set an alarm? The title on my phone's alarm simply read down. I dismissed it as a fluke and went back to sleep, not thinking much of it at the time. But the next night, the same thing happened. This time, I woke up to my phone's alarm again, but the clock showed 3 a.m., and the alarm title was beneath. There was no way I had set that. Surely my brother must have been playing a prank on me. The next morning, I asked my dad to tell him to cut it out. I needed my sleep for school. But my dad insisted he hadn't touched it, and I started to believe him. Feeling uneasy, I took precautionary measures. That night, I set a password on my phone and jotted it down on a sticky note, which I hid behind my bed. I made sure no alarms were set except for one at 8 a.m. But yet again, I was awakened in the dark at 2 a.m. The alarm blared, titled "The." A cold fear crept into my stomach. I was convinced someone was tampering with my phone. The next day, I turned my phone off completely, hoping that whoever was behind this would lose interest. That night, I relied on my old-fashioned alarm clock instead. I set it for 8 a.m. and drifted into sleep, only to wake up again in darkness, my heart racing. My alarm clock was off, and I couldn't see the time. But my phone was blaring an eerie, distorted scream instead of its usual ringtone. Panicking, I quickly turned off the alarm titled "Bed." The clock on my phone showed it was 1 a.m. A feeling of dread washed over me. I reached down to grab my charger from under the bed, only to find that it was missing. Then, I pieced together the terrifying puzzle. The titles of the 4 alarms formed a sentence, down beneath the bed. In that moment, terror gripped me. I tried to pull my arm back, but it was too late. A hand grabbed my wrist, squeezing tightly. I screamed at the top of my lungs, desperate for help. My parents' bedroom door burst open, and I heard my dad's hurried footsteps racing toward my room. When my dad opened the door, he stood there, baseball bat in hand, eyes wide with concern. He immediately dove for the space under my bed, where a figure was half-crouched, struggling to pull me down. Without hesitation, he swung the bat and connected, knocking the intruder out cold. When the police arrived, they confirmed my worst fears. The man had been living beneath my bed, a registered sex offender with a lengthy criminal record. He was known for stalking and terrifying his victims, clearly deriving pleasure from it. That night changed everything for me. I was left shaken, feeling violated in my own home. I had never imagined that a space I considered safe could harbor such darkness. The experience taught me a harsh lesson about vigilance and the importance of knowing who or what might be lurking just beneath the surface. The story number 4 and last story of the day, the disturbing call. I thought I was just having a normal day. My friend Marcus and I usually chatted or hung out every day. We had been through a lot together, and nothing could shake our bond. But on one fateful day, everything changed. Marcus didn't respond to my texts or calls, which was completely out of character for him. As the hours ticked by, a gnawing anxiety settled in my stomach. After some time, I decided to check on him. His house was only a block away, so I walked over, ringing the doorbell repeatedly and knocking with growing urgency. The familiar sound of his laughter was absent, and though his car was parked in the driveway, there was no sign of life. I felt a strange mix of concern and frustration. Maybe he just needed some time alone, but that thought didn't sit well with me. As night crept in, I received a FaceTime call from an unknown number. My heart raced. Hesitantly, I answered, pointing the camera away from my face. When I finally looked at the screen, relief washed over me. It was Marcus. But my relief quickly turned to unease as I took in his disheveled appearance. He looked pale, with dark bags under his eyes, and a look of sheer panic etched across his face. The room behind him was unfamiliar, filled with shadows that made the air feel heavy. "Marcus, where are you?" I asked, my voice tinged with worry. "I'm fine. I'm at home," he said, but the way he avoided eye contact told me otherwise. "Whose phone are you using?" I pressed. There was a long silence, and for a moment he simply stared blankly at the camera. "It's my cousin's," he finally replied, but I could see the fear lurking behind his eyes. Before I could ask more questions, Marcus abruptly demanded, "I need $10,000. Can you send it?" I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but as I observed his serious expression, my laughter faded. "Why do you need that much money?" "Just send it," he insisted, his voice trembling. The urgency in his tone sent a chill down my spine. "Marcus, this isn't like you. What's really going on?" He didn't answer, just continued to stare into the camera, as if waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, the call ended. I sat there in disbelief, my heart racing. Something was clearly wrong, and I felt a rising panic. I resolved to check on him first thing in the morning. The next day, I arrived at his house and rang the doorbell repeatedly, but there was no answer. Frustrated and worried, I gave up and went home. That evening, just as I was about to fall asleep, another FaceTime call from an unknown number interrupted me. "Marcus," I exclaimed as I answered, but the relief I felt was quickly overshadowed by horror. He looked even worse than before. His hair was a tangled mess, and there was a cut on his forehead. Panic gripped my chest. "I need $10,000. Send it to this address," he demanded again, his voice shaky. "Marcus, calm down. What's happening?" I pleaded, but he wouldn't tell me. "Come on, don't point a gun at my back," he said, his voice rising with fear. My heart dropped. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. It was as if a dagger had pierced my heart at his words, and I instinctively interpreted the slight twitch of his left eye as a desperate plea for help. The call cut off abruptly, leaving me in shock. I grabbed my phone and scrambled to remember the address he had mentioned. With trembling hands, I dialed the police, relaying everything I knew. They assured me they would send someone right away. Time stretched endlessly as I waited for news. Finally, the police called back. They had found Marcus, barely conscious, in the basement of an abandoned house miles away. They reported that he had been severely beaten and his captors were long gone. When I rushed to the hospital, a whirlwind of emotions crashed over me. I was terrified of what I might see. Marcus lay in a hospital bed, connected to monitors that beeped steadily. I sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. "Marcus, I'm here," I whispered, my voice breaking. He opened his eyes slowly, and the flicker of recognition brought a small measure of comfort. "What happened?" he croaked. I leaned in closer, desperate to know what he had gone through. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. Just know you're safe now." Days turned into weeks, and Marcus struggled to piece together the fragments of that horrifying night. He described walking home, feeling a sudden blow to the back of his head, and then waking up in a dimly lit basement with strange voices echoing around him. "I thought I was going to die," he confessed one day, tears streaming down his cheeks. "They kept asking for money, saying they knew I had it. I couldn't understand what they wanted." "I'm so sorry, man," I said, my heart aching for him. "You're safe now. We'll get through this together." But the scars from that night ran deeper than I could have imagined. Marcus became increasingly paranoid, constantly glancing over his shoulder and avoiding public places. I tried to support him, but the trauma had taken its toll on our friendship. He was a shell of the person I once knew. Then, one day I received a chilling message from him. "They're watching me. I can't sleep. I think they're coming back." A wave of dread washed over me. I raced to his house, pounding on the door. When he finally opened it, he looked like a ghost, his eyes wide with terror. "Marcus, please. You need to talk to someone," I begged, trying to reach the friend I knew. "They won't leave me alone," he said, voice trembling. "I can't trust anyone." I stayed by his side that night, hoping to dispel the shadows that haunted him. We talked about everything, old memories, dreams, and fears, but I could see the darkness still clinging to him. Months passed, and though Marcus gradually sought therapy, the road to recovery was long and fraught with obstacles. He still struggled to find peace, haunted by nightmares and the echoes of that harrowing night. One night, as I lay in bed, I received a call from him. "I think I'm ready to talk about it," he said, his voice shaky. I rushed to his house, my heart hopeful yet apprehensive. As we sat down, I knew this conversation would be a turning point for him. And as he began to share his experience, I realized the strength of our friendship had weathered the storm. Together, we would face the darkness and, hopefully, emerge into the light. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share.
5 Scary, True Vacation Horror Stories. Episode 8, Prepare to be Gripped, by 5 spine-chilling stories that prove horror isn't just found in movies. From a honeymoon turned deadly, with a hidden discovery in a hotel room, to a romantic beach getaway interrupted by a stalker with violent intentions. Each tale dives into real-life nightmares. Follow the harrowing escape from a deadly highway trap, a vacation encounter with men hiding dark secrets in the shadows, and a cruise where a young girl faces a predator lurking in plain sight. These true stories will make you question if anywhere is truly safe. Are you ready to confront the terror? Story number 1. The Honeymoon. Horror in Miami. After their wedding, newlyweds Emma and Daniel flew to Miami, excited for their honeymoon adventure. Checking into their hotel suite with ocean views, they had visions of a glamorous stay, full of sun and relaxation. But when they opened the door, they were met with an overpowering, sour smell, so out of place in an upscale hotel. Daniel immediately called the front desk, explaining the odor and asking for a room change. The manager apologized, explaining that a large event had filled all the suites, but he offered them a complimentary dinner at a local seafood restaurant while the room was given a thorough cleaning. After an enjoyable meal, Emma and Daniel returned, hoping the issue was resolved. But as they opened the door, the same foul smell greeted them, just as strong as before. Frustrated, Daniel contacted the front desk again, insisting that something be done. The manager, sounding slightly embarrassed, explained that they had thoroughly cleaned, but would try once more if the couple could allow them another hour or two. Deciding to make the best of it, Emma and Daniel took a stroll around the nearby beach, watching the sunset and trying to forget the strangeness of the situation. After an hour, they returned to the suite, only to find that the disturbing odor still lingered. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Daniel decided to investigate the room himself. Convinced that something was amiss, Emma watched as he began sniffing around the corners of the room, checking the closet, the bathroom, and even behind the curtains. Finally, Daniel decided to check the bed. As he lifted the mattress, his face paled, and his hand froze. There, hidden between the mattress and box spring, was something he could barely process. A lifeless figure, curled up and still, concealed in the shadows beneath where they had planned to sleep. Heart pounding, Daniel backed away, pulling Emma toward the door as he called the front desk to report their horrifying discovery. Within minutes, hotel security and police arrived, sealing off the suite and escorting the shaken couple to another room. Emma and Daniel, unable to stay another moment, left Miami the following morning, feeling haunted by the horrifying scene they had stumbled upon. What began as a dream honeymoon ended in an experience they would never forget. Friends and family would come to know the story well, but Emma and Daniel found themselves reluctant to retell it too often. Even years later, the memory lingered like the scent of that room, disturbing, unforgettable, and forever part of their lives. Story number 2, The Beachside Nightmare. In Bali, after months of wedding planning, newlyweds Sophie and Liam were thrilled to escape to the serene beaches of Bali for their honeymoon. Their days were filled with sunlit beaches, vibrant markets, and exploring the island's lush landscapes. On their third evening, Sophie went to a nearby restroom at the beach while Liam waited nearby. She soon returned, looking uneasy, and told him that a strange man had blocked her path as she tried to leave the restroom. She'd only been able to walk away because another group had entered, and the man quickly moved aside. Liam felt uneasy, but tried to reassure her, suggesting they go back to the hotel to freshen up before dinner. As they walked back along the shore, he noticed her scanning the beach nervously. Once they reached the hotel, they took a moment to relax, showered, and got ready for dinner at a popular seaside restaurant. After a wonderful meal and some wandering through the vibrant, lantern-lit streets, they returned to their hotel room close to midnight, ready to unwind. They were startled by a knock at the door. Peering through the peephole, Liam saw a man dressed in a hotel maid's uniform standing outside. Curious but cautious, he cracked the door open to ask what he wanted. Without a word, the man tried to step into the room. Liam quickly blocked his path, asking him to explain himself. The man claimed he'd left a cleaning item inside the room earlier and needed to retrieve it. Liam and Sophie exchanged a confused glance. They hadn't allowed any housekeeping since they checked in. Suspicious, Liam firmly told the man that there was nothing left in the room. Just then, Sophie gasped and whispered urgently, "Liam, that's the man from the beach." A chill ran through Liam's spine as he realized the seriousness of their situation. But before he could react, the man lunged forward, shoving Liam and reaching toward Sophie. In a panic, she grabbed a nearby table lamp and swung it at him, hitting him hard on the head. He stumbled, clutching his face, as Liam pushed him out and locked the door. The commotion quickly drew other guests and staff to the scene. Hotel security arrived, restraining the man as the police were called. Sophie and Liam, visibly shaken, gave statements to the authorities and learned that the man had been a known local troublemaker, often targeting tourists in the area. What was supposed to be a peaceful escape turned into a nightmare Sophie and Liam would never forget. They spent the rest of their trip looking over their shoulders, forever haunted by the memory of the stranger who had almost made their honeymoon one they'd never come home from. Story number 3, The Roadside Trap in Louisiana. Riley and his wife, Jenna, were driving down south from Pennsylvania to visit family in Florida. Their 2 kids fast asleep in the back seat as they crossed the Louisiana border. It was past midnight, and the quiet, rural highway stretched endlessly under the starry sky. Riley was exhausted, but determined to push through the night, hoping to avoid the morning traffic. As he drove, he noticed 2 faint red lights flashing ahead on the empty road, and a vehicle parked sideways, blocking both lanes. Riley slowed down, peering through the windshield. It looked like a car had broken down in the middle of the road, with 2 cones placed around it and flashing SOS lights on either side. Suddenly, 2 figures stepped out from behind the parked car. They were both men, wearing hoodies, one of them lifting a flashlight and gesturing for Riley to stop. Feeling uneasy, Riley instinctively hit the brakes, but as he looked closer, a chill ran down his spine. He quickly rolled up his window, then shifted the car into reverse, moving back slowly. One of the men approached the driver's side window, rapping on it and motioning for Riley to open up. Riley cracked the window just enough to ask what he wanted. The man, with a strangely casual expression, said, "Open the door, please. We just need a little help." Trusting his gut, Riley shut the window fully and pressed on the gas, swerving around the cones and the stopped car. He accelerated down the road, only to notice the flashing lights of a car racing up behind them. Heart pounding, he glanced at Jenna, who had just woken up. "What's going on?" she whispered anxiously. "Just hang on," he muttered, keeping his eyes on the rearview mirror. The car behind them drew closer, its headlights flashing erratically. Suddenly, there was a loud pop, and Riley felt the car pull to the side. The back tire had blown. Another pop followed, and he struggled to keep control as the car slowed. Panicked, Jenna grabbed her phone and called 911, trying to explain their location as the kids woke up, frightened and disoriented. The pursuing car began bumping into their rear bumper, jolting them forward with every hit, just as Riley thought they might be forced off the road. Flashing red and blue lights appeared behind the pursuer, and the car abruptly veered off onto a narrow side road. Minutes later, the police caught up to Riley's family. Relieved but shaken, he described the encounter to the officers, who assured him that other travelers had recently reported similar setups in the area. The family waited for a tow, grateful to have escaped unharmed, but haunted by the knowledge of how close they'd come to disaster. Riley would later tell the story, warning others about the dangers of stopping for anyone on lonely roads. He knew they'd been lucky that night, but the memory of those flashing red lights and the men in the shadows would linger for a long time to come. Story number 4. The isolated road encounter in Spain. Rosa and her husband Miguel had just celebrated their anniversary with a romantic getaway to the Spanish countryside. As they traveled back to Madrid along a scenic but isolated road, their GPS directed them down a narrow route lined with dense fields. The afternoon light was beginning to dim, casting long shadows over the road, and Rosa started to feel an uneasy chill despite the summer warmth. The road became eerily quiet, with no other cars in sight. Just as they were discussing their plans for the rest of the evening, Miguel slowed the car, pointing at something in the distance. A rusted, neon blue car was partially hidden in the tall grass along the side of the road. Its back end jutted out at an awkward angle, as if it had crashed recently. "Maybe someone needs help," Miguel murmured, pulling the car to a cautious stop. He stepped out to investigate, asking Rosa to stay inside and lock the doors. Rosa watched as he slowly approached the car, looking through the windows for any sign of life. She shivered, feeling the unsettling isolation of the area pressing in. Moments later, Rosa saw Miguel jump back suddenly, his face pale. Without hesitation, he turned and ran back to their car, his urgent expression sending Rosa's heart racing. As he slid into the driver's seat, she saw 2 men emerging from behind the rusty vehicle, each carrying large knives. Between them lay something on the ground, partially obscured by the grass. Rosa's breath hitched as she realized it was a body. "Hold on," Miguel muttered, gripping the wheel and accelerating as the two men moved toward their car. One of them waved his knife in the air, shouting something Rosa couldn't understand over the roar of their engine as Miguel sped away. They kept their eyes on the rearview mirror until they were well down the road, convinced the men would follow them. After what felt like an eternity, Miguel finally slowed, his hands trembling. Rosa grabbed her phone, struggling to find a signal to call for help. A small town appeared on the horizon, and they stopped at the first cafe they saw, alerting the local police. Once the authorities arrived, Miguel and Rosa recounted the incident, describing the men and their isolated vehicle. The officers looked grim, explaining that a gang had been known to set up fake accidents to lure unsuspecting travelers. This time, they had used a terrifyingly realistic setup to trap anyone willing to stop and help. Shaken, Miguel and Rosa resumed their journey, grateful they had escaped unharmed, but haunted by the encounter. They had gone from celebrating love and laughter to narrowly evading a nightmare on a quiet country road. From that day on, every unfamiliar road reminded them of the men in the tall grass and the trap they'd barely survived. Story number 5, a terrifying cruise. In the Mediterranean, Inés was 17 when her family set sail on a Mediterranean cruise, a family trip she'd dreamed about for years. She was joined by her parents, her older sister Sofia, and Sofia's boyfriend, Luis. The ship was stunning, the food endless, and the views breathtaking. Inés and her sister shared a room and spent their days sunbathing on deck and exploring the ship's many amenities. One evening, as they headed to the nightclub, Inés noticed an older man sitting by the bar, his eyes fixed intently on her. He looked like he was in his late 40s, dressed a bit too formally for the casual cruise atmosphere, and something about his gaze made her uncomfortable. She glanced away, hoping it was nothing. Hours later, after some dancing, Inés noticed the man again, this time near the entrance, watching her every move. She tried to brush it off, but his stare was unrelenting. When she told Sofia, her sister laughed it off, saying the man was probably harmless. But Inés felt a chill in her bones and left the club early, heading back to her room alone. As she walked down the deserted hallway, she could sense someone behind her. She quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder and catching a glimpse of the man from the club, following her at a distance. Her heart raced, and she practically sprinted to her room, fumbling with her keycard before slipping inside. She locked the door and took a few deep breaths to calm herself. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. Inés froze. She hadn't expected anyone, and her sister had told her she'd be out late. Peeking through the peephole, she saw the man standing outside her door, looking directly at her. She stifled a scream, her hands trembling as she backed away. The man knocked again, louder this time. "Housekeeping," he called, his voice slightly muffled. She knew it was a lie. She'd seen him in the nightclub, not dressed as a crew member. Fear gripped her as he tried the handle, rattling it when it didn't open. Inés barely dared to breathe, hoping he would leave. Just as he began to pound on the door, she heard footsteps in the hallway and a familiar voice, her father's. Inés threw open the door, relief washing over her as her father stared at the man, demanding to know why he was there. The man stammered an excuse, then turned and hurried down the hallway. The family reported the incident to ship security, who questioned the man and confined him to his cabin for the remainder of the trip. Inés spent the rest of the cruise wary, sticking close to her family and never venturing out alone. She never forgot the intensity of the man's stare or the fear that gripped her that night. The cruise was meant to be a celebration, but it left her with a terrifying memory she could never shake. A reminder that danger can sometimes lurk in the unlikeliest places, even on a ship in the middle of the sea. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment below. Story number 1, The Midnight Stalker, a chilling encounter on the graveyard shift. Working the late night shift at a 24-hour convenience store in the quiet town of Cedarvale wasn't something Jess had planned to do forever, but it fit around her college schedule. Most nights were uneventful, with only a few regulars popping in, and she used the time to catch up on studies or daydream about her future. But one unsettling encounter changed all that. It was just after 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday when a tall, disheveled man strolled into the store. Jess gave him a friendly nod, but he didn't respond. Instead, he wandered through the aisles in an odd, slow manner, like he was searching for something or someone. She tried to ignore him, but her unease grew when he began circling back, always glancing her way. Finally, he approached the counter, his dark eyes studying her intensely. "What's a girl like you doing here alone at this hour?" he asked, his tone low and unsettling. Jess forced a polite smile and replied that she was just doing her job. He chuckled softly, leaning in a little too close. "You look like you could use some company," he murmured, his gaze lingering. Jess felt a chill run down her spine. She tried to divert his attention, asking if he needed help finding something, but he just shrugged and stepped back, continuing his slow, predatory circles around the store. She took a few deep breaths, her heart racing, hoping he'd get bored and leave, but he didn't. Instead, he started asking her personal questions: where she lived, when her shift ended, if she was alone. Her unease turned to fear when he reached over the counter, his hand brushing hers. She quickly jerked back, trying to keep her composure. "I need to check the back," she said, feigning calmness, before slipping into the storeroom and locking the door behind her. She texted her manager, hoping for an immediate response, but none came. She waited, heart pounding, in the silence, feeling trapped and vulnerable. After a tense few minutes, she slowly opened the door and peeked out. The store was empty, but the door chimed as he re-entered. Jess locked herself back in, trembling as he lingered outside, occasionally tapping on the door and muttering to himself. When her manager finally arrived, Jess felt an overwhelming wave of relief. But as they reviewed the security footage, they saw something that sent shivers down her spine. The man had been watching her from the parking lot for nearly an hour before he entered. Her boss reported the incident to the police, but they were unable to locate him. To this day, Jess still feels his presence whenever she works the night shift, convinced that he's out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Story number 2, The Silent Watcher, a bone-chilling night shift encounter. Darla had worked the night shift at the Lone Pines Diner for almost a year. Nestled off a desolate stretch of highway, it mostly attracted truckers and the occasional late-night traveler. So when a slow Tuesday evening rolled around, she wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. Little did she know that tonight would be the one she'd never forget. Around 2 a.m., a stranger appeared outside, standing just at the edge of the flickering fluorescent lights by the parking lot. He was tall, his figure mostly obscured by an oversized hoodie, hands jammed into his pockets, face hidden in shadow. Darla gave a quick wave, assuming he was just another customer who'd come inside to escape the cold. But he didn't move. He just stared. At first, she tried to ignore him, chalking it up to the random oddities she'd become accustomed to working the graveyard shift. But something about the man's unbroken gaze felt sinister, chilling even. Every time she glanced out the window, he was there, his dark silhouette a constant, silent presence. Darla's heart began to race, each minute dragging out longer as his figure loomed, unwavering. Growing anxious, she moved to lock the front door, hoping he'd just walk away. As she turned the key, she dared another glance. The man took a slow step forward, still staring, his face barely visible beneath the streetlight's glow. His lips were twisted into a chilling half-smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. Darla felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Swallowing her fear, she ducked behind the counter and pulled out her phone, dialing the police. As she waited, her mind raced with unsettling thoughts. What did he want? Why was he just standing there? A faint scraping sound echoed from outside, followed by a slow, rhythmic tap on the glass door. She peeked over the counter, her heart in her throat, only to see his pale face pressed against the glass. Those dark eyes still locked onto hers. A primal fear coursed through her as she realized he was waiting for her to open the door. Moments later, flashing red and blue lights lit up the diner's walls, and the man turned, walking away without a single glance back. By the time the police arrived, he had vanished, leaving only his eerie presence lingering in the cold air. For weeks, Darla struggled to shake the feeling of being watched. Every night, she'd find herself glancing outside, fearing that the silent watcher would return to haunt her again. Story number 3, The Basement Secret. Chilling phone calls that led to a nightmarish discovery. Elliot had been working late shifts at the Quick Mart, a small convenience store in a quiet part of town, for just over a month. It was usually slow at night, the perfect time for him to catch up on his studies while ringing up the occasional customer. But one Thursday night, things took a terrifying turn that would haunt him long after his shift ended. Around midnight, an older man came into the store, his demeanor unsettling from the start. He shuffled through the aisles, his gaze never quite meeting Elliot's. Yet somehow Elliot felt watched the entire time. Finally, the man bought a few odd items: a spool of wire, duct tape, and a flashlight, and left without saying a word. Uneasy, Elliot shrugged it off, dismissing the man as another eccentric nighttime shopper. Little did he know, this would be the beginning of a nightmare. An hour later, the phone rang. Elliot answered with his usual greeting, expecting a routine call, perhaps someone checking on their lost wallet or asking about store hours. But instead, he was met with silence. Just as he was about to hang up, he heard breathing on the other end. It was faint and deliberate, with an eerie familiarity. He hung up, his pulse quickening. Then, just minutes later, the phone rang again, this time with quiet, disturbing whispers. Elliot couldn't make out any words, but the tone was chilling, almost as if the caller was right there with him. The calls kept coming, each more unnerving than the last, until after an hour, they suddenly stopped. Exhausted and rattled, Elliot finished his shift and hurried home, hoping a few hours' sleep would erase the strange encounter. But as he lay in bed, his phone vibrated again. Another call. This time, a familiar voice. whispered his name, each syllable drawn out with a sense of twisted amusement. A chill ran down his spine. How did this person know his name? Determined to shake off the fear, Elliot decided to investigate the next day. In his basement, he found a stack of strange items arranged on his workbench. That same spool of wire, pieces of duct tape, and several flashlight batteries scattered around. How had they gotten there? He realized, with growing horror, that the man must have been inside his house at some point. Panicked, he reported everything to the police. They searched but found no clues as to who the man was or how he'd managed to enter his home. From then on, every creak and shadow in his basement filled him with a paralyzing fear, as though the stranger might return to finish what he had started. Elliot never worked the night shift again, but to this day, he's haunted by the memory of that night, the basement, the eerie phone calls, and the feeling that someone, somewhere, still knows exactly where he lives. Story number 4, The Midnight Van, a police officer's terrifying encounter with the dead and the living. Officer Maria Sanchez had always believed she'd seen it all. Working the night shift in a city notorious for its share of crime, she was no stranger to the darker side of humanity. But nothing had prepared her for what she would encounter on a cold November night, a night that would change her life forever. Around 2:30 a.m., she was patrolling a deserted stretch near the industrial district when she spotted an old, rusted van parked awkwardly on the shoulder. At first, she thought it was abandoned, maybe someone who had broken down and left it behind. But as she approached, something felt off. The van's windows were completely blacked out, and there was an eerie stillness about it. She radioed in her location and cautiously made her way to the driver's side. The door was unlocked, creaking open with an ominous groan. Shining her flashlight inside, Maria froze. The beam revealed bodies, lifeless, stacked like twisted dolls, their faces obscured and skin ghostly pale. A nauseating smell of decay filled the van, and she stumbled back, choking on the thick stench. Before she could fully process the scene, she heard a shuffle from behind. Her hand instinctively went to her holster, but she wasn't quick enough. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man with hollow eyes and a cold smirk. He moved with terrifying silence, closing the distance in seconds. Maria raised her gun, but the man lunged, slamming her against the side of the van. They struggled, her mind racing as adrenaline surged through her veins. With a burst of strength, she managed to break free, pushing him back just enough to draw her weapon. The man, realizing he had lost the upper hand, took a step back, his eyes never leaving hers. For a chilling moment, they were locked in a silent standoff, her heart pounding in her ears. Then he turned and sprinted into the darkness, disappearing as if he had never been there at all. Shaken and gasping for breath, Maria called for backup, her voice trembling. The team that arrived quickly secured the area, but by then, the man was long gone, vanished without a trace. The van, however, remained, a grim reminder of the horror she'd just survived. The bodies were eventually identified as missing persons, but the killer was never found. Maria returned to duty, but that night left her haunted. She couldn't shake the image of those lifeless bodies or the feeling of being so close to death. Every night shift since, she feels a chill run down her spine, haunted by the memory of that van and the man with hollow eyes who may still be out there lurking in the shadows. Story number 5, The Shadows in the Cornfield. A night patrol gone wrong. Officer Jake Reynolds knew his small town's farmlands well, having grown up in the rural landscape of Mill Creek. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where fields of corn and wheat stretched for miles under the night sky. But that familiar comfort vanished one night when he was called to check on a suspicious vehicle parked on the edge of an overgrown cornfield. It was just after midnight when he arrived. A rusty, mud-streaked van sat on a dirt path leading into the corn, its headlights dim as if recently turned off. Jake's stomach churned as he stepped out of his cruiser. There was something eerie about the van's silence, the darkness of the fields surrounding it like walls closing in. As he approached, his flashlight beam caught a figure sitting motionless in the driver's seat, a man with an unnervingly blank expression, staring straight ahead. Jake tapped on the window. "Sir, this is Officer Reynolds with Mill Creek PD. Everything all right here?" The man slowly turned, his eyes vacant and unsettling. He opened the door without a word, stepping out in a slow, almost mechanical way. The hairs on Jake's neck prickled. The man's movements were too deliberate, his gaze piercing through the darkness, and for a moment, Jake could swear the man's lips twitched into an unnatural grin. "Sir, I'm going to need you to keep your hands where I can see them," Jake commanded, his hand hovering near his holster. But the man didn't respond. Instead, he took a sudden step forward, his body tense, muscles coiled. In an instant, he lunged. The force of the man's attack sent Jake stumbling backward, narrowly keeping his footing as he reached for his weapon. The stranger's grip was like iron, fingers clawing at Jake's uniform, his expression twisted with a malicious intent Jake had never seen before. In a split-second decision, Jake fired his weapon. The man crumpled, the eerie silence of the cornfield returning, save for Jake's ragged breathing. He called for backup, but a wave of guilt washed over him as he stared at the figure on the ground, unmoving. What if he'd misread the situation? What if he'd acted too quickly? The investigation that followed cleared Jake, but his mind remained trapped in the field that night. The shadows in the corn seemed to follow him home, lurking in every corner of his mind. To this day, he avoids that stretch of road, haunted by the memories of the man in the cornfield and the unsettling question he'll never answer. Was he right, or had he let fear pull the trigger? Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, share, and comment below. Story number 1. The Haunting at Raven Hill. A teenage girl named Mia had been living with her single mother, Laura, on the isolated, mist-shrouded slopes of Raven Hill. The hill was dotted with towering oaks that cast long, whispering shadows over their small, time-worn house. For months, their only neighbors were the crows that circled the land and the echoes that whispered through the woods. One chilly autumn night, Mia was jolted awake by a rustling sound. It came from the field behind their house, a patch of land overgrown with wild grass and weeds, untouched for years. Heart pounding, she crept to her window and saw nothing but darkness, though the rustling persisted. The next morning, Laura tried to dismiss Mia's worries as wind in the brush. But as night fell again, Mia and Laura both heard the noise. This time, it was closer, with soft footsteps crunching across the frosted ground. They peered out the window, caught the shadowy outline of a man. Laura, a fierce protector, grabbed an old, rusted shotgun her father had left behind and marched out onto the porch. "Who's there?" Laura shouted, voice trembling. The man didn't move. His head was tilted unnaturally, almost as if he were listening to something they couldn't hear. Then, with impossible speed, he melted back into the woods, leaving nothing behind. Mia and her mother tried to settle down, hoping it was a drifter or hunter. But over the next few nights, the intruder returned. Each time, there were more shadowy figures, more ominous footsteps, and more broken whispers drifting through the trees. One evening, the intruders grew bolder, their forms clearer under the pale moonlight. Laura went out to confront them, but this time, she was ambushed. She stumbled back into the house, bleeding from a deep gash on her forearm. Terrified and desperate, Laura installed motion-triggered security cameras around the property. The following morning, Mia reviewed the footage and felt her heart drop. The cameras had recorded the shadowy figures, but as the intruders moved, they flickered, disappearing and reappearing, as though they were phantoms, entities that had no place in the living world. Their once quiet life on Raven Hill had become a waking nightmare. The footage went viral online, with thousands of viewers trying to explain the terrifying, spectral presence of the visitors. But as the crows circled overhead, Mia and Laura knew this was no internet mystery. Whatever haunted Raven Hill was coming for them, and it wasn't done yet. Story number 2, The Night Stalkers, a true tale of terror. Jake had always loved the quiet, suburban life he shared with his mother, Evelyn, in their small, tree-lined neighborhood of Willow Ridge. Life felt safe and predictable, where the only things that went bump in the night were squirrels rustling in the trees or a stray dog howling at the moon. But that sense of security shattered one humid summer evening. It was a Friday night, and Jake was watching TV while Evelyn finished up some paperwork in the kitchen. The sun had set, casting their cozy home in shadows, when a faint creaking noise pierced through the silence. Jake paused, straining to hear. It was followed by a hushed whisper, too low to decipher. Heart racing, he exchanged a worried glance with his mother. Evelyn crept to the front window and peeked through the blinds. Her face went pale. "Jake," she whispered urgently, "there are 2 men at the door." Before they could react, the front doorknob twisted and rattled. The intruders were trying to force their way in. Panicked, Evelyn signaled for Jake to follow her. They quietly rushed up the stairs and into Jake's bedroom, locking the door behind them. The intruders, undeterred, shattered a side window and entered. Jake knew they had only moments before the men would be upon them. In a desperate act of survival, he slid open his bedroom window, and he and his mother climbed out onto the slanted roof. As they leaped off into the darkness, landing with a painful thud in the bushes below, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from inside the house. The mother and son sprinted to a neighbor's yard and banged on the door until someone let them in and called the police. By the time authorities arrived, the intruders had vanished, leaving the house in disarray. The police found muddy footprints, but no other clues, chalking it up to a robbery gone wrong. Jake and Evelyn tried to move on, but the fear never really faded. A week later, in the dead of night, their landline rang. Evelyn answered, only to be met with the unsettling sound of slow, heavy breathing. She slammed the phone down, her hands trembling. Moments later, Jake's cell phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You can run, but you can't hide. See you soon." Panic set in. The police traced the number, but it led nowhere. Security measures were tightened, and friends took turns staying over. But Jake and his mother knew something was coming. Their story spread rapidly online, and the footage from their doorbell camera showing shadowy figures creeping up the driveway went viral. Willow Ridge's residents whispered about the so-called Night Stalkers, and theories flooded the internet. Some claimed the intruders were part of a secret society. Others suggested something more sinister, perhaps supernatural. But to Jake and Evelyn, it wasn't just a viral sensation. It was a nightmare that left them forever changed, waiting for the next knock that might come, or the shadow that might never truly leave. Story number 3, The Whispering Walls, a terrifying, true encounter. Mia Patel, a 15-year-old high school sophomore, had always thought of her home in the bustling city of Atlanta as a sanctuary from the chaos of the world. With her parents working late most days, Mia often enjoyed the solitude, curled up in her room with her books or sketching at her desk. One Tuesday evening, as rain splattered against the window and distant thunder rolled through the sky, Mia was buried in her math homework. The house was hushed, save for the hum of the ceiling fan. Then it happened. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from inside the walls. She froze, chalking it up to old pipes or perhaps a stray mouse. But as she focused, the sound grew louder, almost as if someone or something was trying to escape. Her breath caught in her throat as the scratching turned into soft, whisper-like murmurs. Her pen slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly on her desk. The noise immediately ceased, replaced by a thick, unnatural silence. Trembling, Mia called out, "Hello?" hoping her parents had come home early. There was no answer, but before she could think, a sudden thud came from behind a small storage panel embedded in the wall near her bed, a rarely used compartment where old holiday decorations were kept. Terror coursed through her veins, and she let out a piercing scream. Her parents, Annika and Raj, burst through the front door minutes later, having just arrived home. Hearing Mia's cries, they raced upstairs and found her shaking. Pointing at the storage panel, Raj cautiously approached the small door, gripping a nearby umbrella like a makeshift weapon. He threw the panel open, and there, hunched among dusty boxes, was a disheveled, wild-eyed man. The intruder lunged, but Raj managed to block him, pinning him to the ground. Annika called the police, and within moments, the flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars lit up the rain-soaked street. Officers arrived and arrested the man, whose clothes were filthy, and his eyes darted around with a manic intensity. When the police searched the compartment, what they found sent shivers down Mia's spine. A notebook filled with crude sketches of her face, strange ramblings about watching and waiting, and a collection of small items Mia hadn't even realized had gone missing. A hairbrush, a keychain, and a single, crumpled page from her sketchbook. Investigators determined that the man had likely been living in the crawl spaces and walls of the house for days, maybe even weeks, watching Mia through cracks and holes. The story quickly went viral, and Mia's once safe haven became a nationwide symbol of one of the most chilling urban nightmares. Even after the man was safely behind bars, the memory haunted Mia. The house was never quite the same, and every creak and whisper of the old walls felt like a reminder. You never know who might be watching. Story number 4. Haunted by the Nightwalkers, a terrifying beach encounter. It was supposed to be a quiet, romantic evening For Chris and Maria Johnson, the newlyweds had rented a small beachside cottage in Oregon to escape the noise of their busy lives in the city. On their first night, the couple decided to take a moonlit walk along the deserted stretch of coastline. The gentle lapping of the waves and the soothing crash of the surf felt like nature's lullaby. Hand in hand, they strolled along the water, leaving trails of footprints behind them in the damp sand. They laughed and shared stories, feeling utterly alone and at peace under the starry sky. But as they walked, Chris suddenly froze. He turned his gaze down, frowning. "Did you notice those?" he asked, pointing to a set of footprints just a few yards from theirs. The tracks seemed recent, and oddly, they didn't lead to or from the water, appearing out of nowhere and heading toward the dunes. Maria's smile wavered, but she shrugged, trying to stay cheerful. "Probably someone else from earlier," she replied, though her voice sounded less convincing than she intended. Still, the couple continued on, trying to brush off the unease creeping into the moment. Then came the sound. A low, guttural clicking echoed from the dunes, like an insect's wings trapped inside a cavernous chest. The couple halted, gripping each other tighter. "What was that?" Maria whispered, her pulse quickening. They both turned toward the sand dunes, where shadows twisted under the silvery glow of the moon. It was then that they saw them, hunched, human-like figures, with elongated limbs, skin pale and mottled, as if washed ashore from the depths of the ocean. Their heads were bald, and their eyes reflected the moonlight like cold, dead mirrors. One of the creatures tilted its head, locking its gaze with Chris. The low clicking grew louder. Panicking, Chris and Maria ran as fast as they could back to their cottage, hearts pounding until they reached the safety of their porch. Gasping for breath, they locked the doors and turned on every light. Shaking, Chris called the local police. Though skeptical, an officer came by to investigate, finding nothing but washed away tracks and whispering winds. Despite the authorities' disbelief, Chris couldn't let it go. Every Friday night since, he has returned to that very stretch of sand, hoping, or perhaps dreading, to catch another glimpse of the creatures. But deep down, he and Maria know one thing for sure. Something watches from the dunes, waiting for another chance to come closer. Story number 5. The Midnight Spectre of Willow Ridge Academy. Willow Ridge Academy had always felt eerie at night. The prestigious high school, built over a century ago, held many secrets within its creaky walls. Mark Harris, a part-time janitor, had worked the night shift for years, but no amount of experience could shake the feeling of being watched as he cleaned the empty halls. One cold autumn evening, Mark clocked in as usual, his keys jingling with every step. The building was silent, the kind of silence that pressed heavily against the ears. He started his rounds, mopping the tiled floors of the West Wing and occasionally humming to break the unsettling quiet. It was around 2 a.m. when things started to go wrong. As he pushed his mop bucket toward the main science corridor, a sudden light flickered on in one of the classrooms. Room 213, to be exact. Mark paused, a chill running down his spine. He knew he had turned off every light earlier, and the building was supposed to be empty. Heart pounding, he stepped cautiously toward the room, peering through the small glass window in the door. Inside, a tall, thin man stood under the harsh fluorescent glow. The stranger wore an old, tattered suit, stained and fraying at the edges. His face was ghostly pale, with sunken eyes that seemed to bore into Mark's soul. The man lifted one hand and gave a slow, deliberate wave. Mark stumbled backward, dropping his mop with a loud clatter. He turned and sprinted down the hallway, not stopping until he reached the security office. Shaking, he pounded on the door, and the only security guard on duty, Jim, let him in. "What happened?" Jim asked, eyes narrowing with concern as he took in Mark's terrified expression. Mark described what he had seen, his voice trembling. Jim, though skeptical, agreed to check the security footage. Together, they sat in the dimly lit office, eyes glued to the screens as the footage played. There it was, room 2, 13's light flickering on, the strange man stepping out of the shadows. But what happened next made both men freeze. The footage showed the figure moving with unnatural fluidity, emerging from a basement stairwell that hadn't been used in decades. Then he vanished, right back into the basement, as if melting into the darkness. "We're calling the cops," Jim said, voice shaking. When authorities arrived, they searched the entire basement, every inch of storage and disused rooms. But there was no trace of the man, only cobwebs and dust-covered furniture. He was never found. Mark quit his job at Willow Ridge the following week, unable to shake the feeling of that wave, the chilling gaze that had locked onto him from across the hall. And though new janitors have come and gone, the story of the Midnight Spectre continues to haunt the staff. Some say that if you wander the halls at the wrong hour, you might just see him again, waving from a room. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, subscribe. Story number 6, The Chilling Discovery in the Sealed Attic. Natalie had always felt drawn to the charm of old country homes. Working as a professional housekeeper for affluent clients in rural estates was a dream job for the adventurous 24-year-old. One morning, she found herself in an eerie mansion deep in the woods of Ridgewood, Pennsylvania. The house, built in the late 1800s, stood solemnly with creaking floors and whispers of history hanging heavy in the air. As she dusted ornate shelves and polished mirrors, Natalie noticed a narrow door at the end of a hallway on the 3rd floor. A handwritten sign dangled from its tarnished brass handle. "Do not enter." Her curiosity sparked instantly. What could possibly be behind that sealed door? Her employer, an elderly woman named Mrs. Remington, had specifically instructed her not to disturb the attic. But as hours passed and the house's silence thickened, Natalie couldn't resist. She rationalized that a simple peek couldn't hurt. With a sharp twist of the creaky doorknob, the door groaned open. A wave of musty air rushed out, making her shiver. The attic was dimly lit by a single bulb swinging on a chain, casting distorted shadows. Dust motes floated around her like tiny spirits. She stepped in and was immediately overwhelmed by the bizarre scene. The walls were lined with old photographs, but they weren't just family portraits or scenic memories. They were black and white snapshots of children with blank expressions, each image marked by dates and numbers. Some photographs had red circles drawn around the children's eyes. Natalie's stomach twisted. In the far corner of the attic, she spotted an old trunk. Against her better judgment, she unlatched it, and what she found sent an icy jolt down her spine. Antique dolls, each dressed in tattered clothing, with their glass eyes wide open, staring into the void. Scattered among the dolls were dusty notebooks filled with rambling journal entries, speaking of strange rituals, missing children from local villages, and offerings to unnamed forest spirits. Her pulse raced as she suddenly became hyper-aware of her surroundings. Was she being watched? The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Natalie's gaze darted upward, and her breath hitched. Tucked into the wooden rafters was a small, blinking red light. A hidden camera was observing her every move. Panic set in. Who had been watching her? Was Mrs. Remington monitoring her right now? Or was it someone else entirely? She bolted from the attic, heart pounding, and raced downstairs. As she grabbed her belongings, she felt a cold breeze sweep through the house, and a faint whisper echoed behind her. "You shouldn't have come here." Natalie didn't stop to look back. She sped out the door, vowing never to return. Within days, news spread that the Remington estate had a dark history. Decades ago, the mansion's original owners were implicated in the disappearances of local children. But the cases had gone cold. Natalie's chilling experience became a viral sensation, a mystery too unsettling to ignore, as everyone questioned, who was really watching from the attic? Story number 7, Midnight Pursuit. The Nightmare on Shadow Creek Road. It was supposed to be a quiet night at Blackwood Cafe, tucked along the dimly lit streets of Shadow Creek, Ohio. Jenny, a 22-year-old barista, had just finished her closing shift. Her co-worker, Malik, was locking up when a rusted old van pulled into the nearly deserted parking lot. The headlights blazed, and 2 men stepped out. They were rough-looking, dressed in greasy overalls, and had an unsettling presence that made Jenny's skin crawl. One of the men, heavy-set with a scruffy beard, approached them. "Hey, can you spare some cash for gas?" he asked, his voice almost too polite. Jenny's instincts screamed at her. Something about the way the man smiled didn't feel right. Malik shot her a worried glance and shook his head. "Sorry, we don't have anything," he replied. The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold glare. Without another word, he and his companion backed off. Jenny and Malik quickly got into their cars, their nerves on edge. As Jenny drove out of the lot, she noticed the van's headlights turning on, following them. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, and her heart raced. Shadow stretched ahead of them, a dark, lonely highway lined with dense forest. Jenny kept glancing in her rearview mirror. The van was still there, keeping pace. Malik's car was right behind hers, but the van was inching closer. Then, without warning, the van accelerated, pulling alongside Malik's car. Jenny's stomach knotted in fear. A loud bang shattered the silence, and Jenny screamed. The van had fired a shot. Malik swerved desperately, narrowly missing a ditch. Jenny slammed on the gas, her mind racing. Was this really happening? The van sped up, trying to force Malik off the road. Jenny knew she had to act fast. Up ahead, she saw a roadside diner, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. She made a snap decision, turning sharply into the diner's parking lot, honking frantically. Malik followed, and the van screeched to a stop on the highway. Hesitating for a moment, Jenny and Malik burst into the diner, breathless and panicked. The few patrons inside turned to stare. A burly trucker stood up, taking in their terror. "What's going on?" he demanded. Before they could answer, the van peeled away, its tires screeching, disappearing into the night. The police arrived soon after, but the van was long gone. As Jenny and Malik recounted the harrowing chase, they realized how close they had come to disaster. The officers told them that Shadow Creek Road had a dark reputation, unsolved disappearances, stories of travelers never making it to their destination. Jenny's story went viral almost immediately, Spreading across social media, everyone shuddered at the thought of being hunted on an isolated road by strangers whose intentions were far more sinister than anyone could imagine. And to this day, drivers on Shadow Creek Road swear they've seen a rusted van lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victims. Story number 8. Chilling encounter at Ravenwood Sanatorium. Every small town has its legends, and Westfield was no different. Rumors about Ravenwood Sanatorium had circulated for decades. The abandoned psychiatric hospital, nestled at the edge of the town's dense forest, was said to be haunted by the spirits of former patients. For Jamie and his best friend, Alyssa, both 17 and eager to create a viral video for their paranormal YouTube channel, this place was the perfect backdrop. Armed with flashlights and a camera, the two ventured into the decaying building one overcast evening. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and shattered glass crunched under their sneakers. The peeling walls seemed to close in, echoing with a history better left forgotten. Jamie, always the brave one, led the way while Alyssa recorded. Her voice hushed as she narrated their exploration. This is where they say Dr. Faulkner conducted his unethical experiments, Jamie whispered, pointing at a rusted operating table. Alyssa shuddered, her nerves already frayed. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a distant, metallic clang echoing from the end of a long hallway. They both froze. "Did you hear that?" Alyssa breathed, her grip tightening on the camera. Jamie nodded, swallowing hard. They crept toward the sound, their flashlights casting nervous beams over graffiti-scarred walls. As they neared the source of the noise, something made them halt in their tracks. There, just ahead, a head slowly peeked out from around a corner. It wasn't human. The face was twisted and pale, eyes wide with an unnatural gleam. Alyssa let out a strangled gasp. Before they could react, the head snapped back, disappearing into the darkness. The silence was shattered by heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing closer. Panic surged through them. Jamie grabbed Alyssa's hand, and they bolted, racing down a maze of corridors as the footsteps followed, relentless and unyielding. "Over here," Jamie shouted, spotting a shattered window. With a surge of adrenaline, he helped Alyssa climb out first. She stumbled onto the overgrown lawn, breathless, and pulled him through just as something heavy slammed against the inside of the window frame. They tumbled onto the ground, gasping for air, as the footsteps finally ceased. When they dared to look back, the window was empty, but a cold, oppressive energy still radiated from the building. They scrambled to their feet, sprinting until the asylum was a distant shadow behind them. Only later, reviewing the footage, did they realize the camera had caught something horrifying. That twisted face watching them from the hallway, lingering just a little too long before vanishing. Jamie and Alyssa's harrowing escape spread like wildfire online, captivating viewers with the bone-chilling footage. Ravenwood Sanatorium became a viral sensation, but no one dared to venture there again, because some legends, it seemed, were better left undisturbed. Story number 9. The sinister secret beneath our floorboards. When Emma and Lucas moved into their quaint 1920s fixer-upper in Maple Grove, they were captivated by the charm of the old place. With ivy climbing the brick walls and a wraparound porch, it felt like the perfect place to start a new chapter together. Little did they know that the house harbored a chilling secret. A few weeks in, strange noises began disturbing their nights. It was subtle at first, soft scuffling beneath their bedroom floor, and the occasional low creak. They dismissed it as the house settling, but the disturbances grew louder and more frequent. Emma would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced she'd heard whispering. Lucas, trying to reassure her, joked that maybe they had friendly house mice. One evening, the noises became impossible to ignore. As Emma prepared for bed, a loud, metallic clang resonated from the closet floor. Her heart thudded in her chest. Lucas grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, determined to put an end to the mystery once and for all. With Emma standing behind him, he pried up a loose floorboard. What they uncovered made them both recoil in disbelief. A hidden staircase spiraled downward into darkness. The air that seeped up was cold and heavy, carrying the stench of damp earth. Summoning their courage, they descended into the hidden space. At the bottom, they discovered a small, makeshift room. An old mattress lay in one corner, stained and worn, alongside empty cans of food and a pile of yellowed newspapers. The realization was terrifying. Someone had been living there. Before they could process what they were seeing, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from above. Lucas motioned for Emma to stay quiet. As they crouched in the shadows, the closet door creaked open, and the faint beam of a flashlight swept over the entrance to the hidden room. Whoever it was knew about this secret space. Lucas held his breath, clutching the crowbar. But then the footsteps retreated. They waited, hearts pounding, until the silence returned. Racing back upstairs, they slammed the hidden entrance shut and called the police. While they waited, Lucas stood guard, weapon in hand. Suddenly, there was a violent pounding at the back door. Emma screamed as a figure threw himself against the glass, snarling and wild-eyed. It was a man, clothes tattered and eyes glinting with madness. He screamed incoherently, battering the door with relentless force. Lucas grabbed Emma, and they ran, fleeing through the front door just as the intruder broke through. The police arrived moments later, but the crazed man had vanished into the night. The officers found evidence of someone squatting beneath their home for weeks, possibly months, moving in and out through a network of old storm tunnels. The story went viral, with thousands horrified by the idea of an unseen stranger lurking so close. Emma and Lucas never spent another night in that house. The hidden room, the midnight intruder, and the whispering shadows remain a terrifying memory, a grim reminder that sometimes even the walls of your home can harbor unspeakable secrets. Story number 10, The Phantom. Next door, a whisper in the dark. Carter and Maya had finally found their dream apartment in the bustling city of Asheville. The building was a blend of old-world charm and modern amenities, and their neighbors seemed friendly enough. But within the first week, a strange and unsettling pattern emerged. Every night, just as they tried to drift off, the walls would come alive with muffled yelling from the apartment next door. It sounded like an angry man, his voice rising and falling, as if in an endless argument. Exhausted and frustrated, Carter decided to talk to the building manager. He explained the late-night disturbances, expecting to hear that their neighbors were having loud disputes. Instead, the manager furrowed his brow in confusion. "That unit," he said, shaking his head. "Only Mrs. Callahan lives there. She's a sweet, elderly widow who's lived here for decades. No one else." Carter returned to their apartment, feeling unsettled. He told Maya, and they both decided it had to be a mistake. Yet night after night, the yelling continued. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the noises stopped. The silence felt like a weight pressing down on their home, but they were relieved to finally get some rest. A week later, in the deep, still hours of the night, Maya woke up to the feeling of something cold brushing against her skin. Her eyes snapped open, and her breath caught in her throat. A figure loomed over Carter's side of the bed. It was a shadowy shape, tall and unnervingly still, whispering Carter's name in a voice that dripped with malice. Paralyzed with fear, Maya couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure bent lower, its whispers growing more intense, more desperate. Carter stirred and opened his eyes, and the shadow evaporated, leaving only a lingering, icy chill. Gasping, Maya clung to Carter, recounting what she had seen. He tried to comfort her, but his own fear was unmistakable. The next morning, desperate for answers, the couple decided to visit Mrs. Callahan. When she opened the door, her eyes were tired and haunted, as if she carried the weight of countless sleepless nights. "I know why you're here," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He never left me alone, even in death." Mrs. Callahan explained that her late husband had been a bitter, angry man, their marriage plagued by shouting and rage. When he passed, she thought she was finally free, but his presence remained, the arguments replaying like a cruel echo through the walls. The shadowy figure Maya had seen was not just a ghost. It was a fragment of Mrs. Callahan's torment, unleashed on anyone who dared live close by. The story went viral, drawing thousands who shuddered at the thought of a spirit so resentful it could haunt the living long after death. Carter and Maya moved out not long after, but every so often, Maya still wakes up in a cold sweat, certain she hears her name whispered in the darkness. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. Story number 1, Halloween Night. Pursuit, a true nightmare in the shadows. It was Halloween night, 2015. A group of close friends, Sam, Liam, Ben, and Josh, ventured out into their peaceful lakeside town, dressed as characters from their favorite superhero universe. Sam, the second tallest, played Batman, while Liam, shorter and stockier, took on the role of Robin. Ben, tall and lanky, opted for Nightwing, and Josh, the roundest of the bunch, suited up as Bane. They roamed house to house, their candy bags getting heavier, even as the excitement began to wear thin. By 9 p.m., the streets grew quieter, the festive lights dimmed, and the glow of carved pumpkins became fewer. The friends decided to call it a night. Once their sacks overflowed, they were approaching a large Victorian house, wrapped in a layer of shadowy mist from the nearby lake. On the porch sat a massive black cauldron, but Sam's heart sank when he realized it was empty. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the window startled them all. Turning to the sound, they saw no one. But then the front door creaked open. An older man stepped out, his expression eerie, his eyes hollow. He wore a grimy sweatshirt and beckoned with a bony finger. "Come in, boys. I have more candy inside," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. Liam, the bravest of the group, stepped forward, but Sam pulled him back. "No thanks," Sam replied, trying to sound polite but firm. The old man's smile faded, and he simply watched as the boys backed away. The door closed behind him, echoing into the night. The friends hurried down the street, away from the unsettling house. They tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but a deep sense of dread clung to them. As they walked past the woods, lining the edge of the nature preserve, Ben suddenly froze. "Guys, did you hear that?" he whispered. The group went silent, and the crunch of leaves and snap of twigs made their blood run cold. They strained their ears, trying to hear more. It wasn't just one set of footsteps. There were two, maybe even three, following them from the woods. Liam, always the defiant one, shouted into the darkness, "We're not scared. Leave us alone, or we'll make you regret it." His voice trembled, betraying his bravado. In that moment, a heavy branch cracked, and the boys' fear burst into a full-blown sprint. They ran hard, adrenaline pumping, hearing the unmistakable rush of feet pursuing them. Sam's chest burned, and he barely registered the sound of the backyard gate slamming shut as they dove into Josh's house. The boys locked the door, collapsing onto the living room floor, chests heaving. But the nightmare wasn't over. A loud bang echoed from the back door, and they heard a whisper of footsteps on the porch. Josh's mom and sister returned home moments later, flooding the house with light. Relief washed over them, but it was short-lived. An hour later, Sam's phone buzzed. A text from Josh. "It wasn't my mom," it read. Confused, Sam asked what he meant. Josh responded with chilling detail. His mom said she never went into the backyard that night. They called the police, but the shadowy figures from the woods were never found. Story number 2. The Halloween white van nightmare that still haunts me. Halloween night, 2018. 18-year-old Alex had promised his mom he'd chaperone his little brother, Lucas, and their friends, Mateo and Kai, through their neighborhood. Alex didn't mind too much. He'd dressed in a hoodie and jeans, happy to be the cool older brother who collected some candy for himself. It was getting late, and the younger boys, clutching their bags of sweets, insisted they weren't ready to go home yet. But Alex's patience was running thin. "We're wrapping this up soon," he told them, as they made their way down Maple Avenue, the last stretch before heading back. Suddenly, headlights illuminated the road, and a rusty white van pulled up alongside them. The van rolled to a slow stop, and the driver, a gaunt man with dark circles under his eyes, leaned over to speak. "Hey there, kid," he said, smiling uncomfortably. "Can you help me with something?" Alex felt a pang of unease. "I'm sorry, but we need to get home," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. The man persisted, explaining that he needed an extra set of hands to fix the passenger seat. "It'll only take a second," he urged. Reluctantly, Alex agreed, not wanting to seem rude, but he told Lucas and the others to stay close. The van parked, and Alex opened the passenger door. He began fiddling with the seat, while the driver issued confusing instructions. "Lift it. Now push it back down. No, try again." It was like he was stalling. Then, out of nowhere, Lucas and his friends started screaming. Alex's heart dropped, and he stumbled as he rushed out of the van. Behind him, a second man had emerged from the back of the van and grabbed Mateo, pulling him toward the open door. Without thinking, Alex lunged at the attacker, pushing him away. The driver shoved Alex to the ground, and chaos erupted. Just when Alex thought things couldn't get worse, the front door of a nearby house swung open. An older man, armed with a rifle, stormed out onto the porch. "Get off my property," the man roared, firing a warning shot into the sky. The attackers panicked, abandoning their plan, and leapt back into the van. Tires screeched as the vehicle sped away into the night, leaving Alex gasping for breath and clinging to Lucas and the others. The homeowner, still holding the rifle, rushed over to make sure the kids were all right. His stern expression softened when he saw how shaken they were. Alex thanked the man repeatedly, but he couldn't shake the horror of what just happened. The police were called and statements were given, but the white van had vanished. The next morning, Alex's heart sank as he watched the news. A 9-year-old boy from a nearby town had gone missing the same night. Alex couldn't stop the guilt gnawing at him, replaying the encounter in his mind. He knew he had done what he could, but the fear of almost losing Lucas and knowing someone else wasn't so lucky haunted him forever. Story number 3. Halloween night. Horror. Chased by a machete-wielding phantom. Growing up in the remote backwoods of Northern Virginia, Halloween was more eerie than festive. My friends, Caleb, Trey, and I had grown used to the darkness of winding, empty roads lined with dense forest. That year, we decided to venture out for one last hurrah before adulthood pulled us apart. We figured we'd hit a few scattered houses, collect whatever candy we could, and call it a night. The evening started uneventfully. At our first few stops, kind families loaded our bags with chocolate bars and caramel apples. We exchanged nervous laughs, aware of how lonely the rural area made trick-or-treating feel. After a slow trudge down a long dirt road, we stumbled upon an old, run-down house that oozed Halloween spirit. The front yard was draped with faux spider webs, and carved pumpkins lit the walkway. But what caught our attention was the sign nailed to the front door. "Out of candy," it read. "For more treats, come to the backyard, if you dare." An arrow pointed around the side of the house leading into the woods. Caleb's eyes lit up. "Let's check it out," he grinned. Always the thrill seeker. Trey shook his head, visibly anxious, but followed us reluctantly as we moved toward the dark backyard. The air felt colder, and every step we took seemed amplified by the dead leaves crunching beneath our shoes. In the backyard, a single torch cast an orange glow, illuminating a handwritten note pinned to a wooden post. "Candy seekers," it read. "The treasure lies near the flames." Caleb approached the torch, poking around in search of any hidden sweets, while Trey and I nervously watched our surroundings. Suddenly, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the upstairs window of the house. A shadow pulled back, and the blinds snapped shut. "Guys, I saw something," I whispered. But Caleb dismissed me. Then, Trey let out a gasp. Near the shed at the edge of the clearing, a figure was watching us, pale and unmoving. They vanished into the darkness as quickly as they appeared. My gut screamed at me to leave, but before I could say anything, Trey pointed into the woods. Emerging from the shadows was a figure in a tattered black hoodie, wearing a grotesque, expressionless mask. In his hand glinted the unmistakable blade of a machete. Caleb, still convinced it was a Halloween prank, took a hesitant step forward. But when the masked figure lunged, swinging the machete, reality hit us. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Trey's arm as we bolted for the front yard. The sound of pounding footsteps followed close behind, and my heart felt like it might explode. We burst onto the dirt road, adrenaline propelling us back to Caleb's car. But just as we thought we were safe, another shadowy figure emerged, blocking our escape route. We split, screaming for help, until porch lights flickered on at a nearby house. The figures retreated, melting into the woods as suddenly as they had appeared. Shaking and out of breath, we banged on the neighbor's door, begging for help. The police arrived and followed us back, but the house was empty. The torches, notes, and any sign of life had vanished. Authorities later told us the The property had been abandoned for over a year. That Halloween night left scars deeper than any trick-or-treating experience could. Rural nights have never felt quite as safe since. Thanks for watching video. Please like, share, and subscribe Nightmare Shadows. Story number 1, Night of Terror, the Halloween heist that ended in tragedy. It was supposed to be an unforgettable Halloween night. Mateo and his friends, Ava, Jamie, and Eli, had spent weeks preparing for their grand Halloween party. Mateo's parents were away on a long-awaited vacation, leaving him in charge of their sprawling house in a quiet Los Angeles suburb. The place was decked out in cobwebs, flickering lights, and carved pumpkins. Guests in elaborate costumes arrived in droves, filling the house with laughter and energy. The evening started with music pounding through the walls, echoing through the neighborhood. Everyone was dancing, sharing ghost stories, and taking endless selfies in their costumes. Mateo, dressed as a vampire, was in high spirits, joking with Ava, who looked stunning as a dark fairy. Eli, a comic book enthusiast, had gone all out as his favorite superhero, while Jamie sported a clever werewolf costume. As midnight approached, the party was at its peak. That's when the nightmare began. The front door burst open with a loud bang, sending a wave of silence through the crowd. 3 figures stormed in, each one masked and dressed in black from head to toe. Their masks were bone-white skulls, grinning with a sinister edge. The tallest intruder brandished a gun, his voice cutting through the terrified hush as he shouted, "Everybody down, now." Panic erupted. Screams filled the air as guests threw themselves to the ground, clutching each other in fear. The intruders moved through the sea of terrified partygoers, demanding phones, wallets, and jewelry. One of them, shorter but equally menacing, kicked over a table of drinks, glass shattering everywhere. The gunman trained his weapon on anyone who hesitated, and every small movement felt like a gamble between life and death. Ava, trembling, clutched Mateo's hand as they lay on the living room floor. Eli tried to calm Jamie, whose breathing had turned into frantic, shallow gasps. Mateo could feel his heart pounding against his ribcage, the adrenaline coursing through his veins like fire. But the worst moment was yet to come. As one of the masked figures rifled through a guest's belongings, a commotion erupted near the back of the house. Someone had tried to make a break for it. The gunman turned, fury blazing in his eyes, and fired a deafening shot. The bullet found its mark. A young man, dressed as a pirate, fell to the floor, blood pooling around him. Screams echoed in every corner of the house, now a place of terror and chaos. The intruders fled, vanishing into the night before anyone could react. The once festive home was now a scene of horror, filled with the sobs of friends clinging to each other. Mateo felt paralyzed, his mind struggling to process what had just unfolded. Ava was in shock, her dark fairy wings crumpled and tear-streaked makeup staining her face. Police sirens pierced the air minutes later, but it felt like an eternity. EMTs rushed in, and the party became a blur of flashing lights, crying guests, and emergency responders. The night had turned from a celebration to a tragedy that no one would ever forget. That Halloween party left scars far deeper than any could see. For Mateo and his friends, it wasn't just about survival. It was the haunting memory of a night that went horribly wrong. A reminder of how fragile life truly is. Story number 2, The Halloween Knocks That Turned Deadly. It was a quiet Halloween night in the sleepy town of Maplewood. Emma Lopez had just finished handing out candy to the last group of trick-or-treaters. The streets were now eerily silent, and a chilly breeze rustled the dried leaves that littered the front lawn. Emma closed the door and locked it, relieved to finally enjoy some peace. At 17, she was spending the evening home alone while her parents visited friends out of town. With her phone in hand and a bowl of leftover candy, she settled onto the couch, ready to binge her favorite horror movies. Just as the opening credits rolled, a loud knock echoed through the house. Emma jumped, her heart skipping a beat. She checked her phone. 11:45 p.m. It was way too late for more trick-or-treaters. Nervously, she approached the front door, peeking through the peephole. No one was there. Probably some prank, she muttered, trying to shake off the unease. She turned back toward the living room, but before she could get comfortable, the knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. Goosebumps crawled up her arms. Emma hesitated, then threw open the front door, hoping to scare off whoever was trying to mess with her. But the porch was empty. The street was shrouded in darkness, with only a flickering streetlight down the block casting long, eerie shadows. Emma's stomach tightened. She closed the door, double-checking the lock, and tried to laugh off the fear creeping up her spine. She texted her best friend, Lily. "Weird stuff happening. Someone keeps knocking and vanishing." Lily replied with a laughing emoji. "It's Halloween. Chill, Em. Probably just kids having fun." Emma sighed, attempting to focus on her movie, but her mind refused to settle. Moments later, a soft tapping sounded from the back door in the kitchen. Her body froze, pulse racing. The knocks were rhythmic, slow, and deliberate. Emma grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly made her way to the back door. With trembling hands, she pulled aside the curtain on the door's small window. Once again, there was nothing, just the dark outline of the woods behind her house. She stepped away from the door, her mind racing. "Get a grip, Emma," she whispered. But her voice felt hollow, unconvincing. Then, the lights went out. The house plunged into darkness, and Emma's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the pitch-black room. Before she could call for help, a thud resonated from upstairs. Someone was in the house. Emma stifled a scream, heart pounding in her ears. She backed into a corner of the kitchen, clutching the knife tighter. Another noise followed, this time the unmistakable creak of floorboards. Moving closer, tears streamed down her face as she tried to steady her shaking hands. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, nearly making her drop it. It was a text from an unknown number. Knock, knock. Emma's blood ran cold. Whoever was in her house knew she was terrified. Summoning every ounce of courage, she made a run for the front door, flinging it open and sprinting into the street. Her screams echoed down the empty road until lights flickered on in neighboring houses. Later, the police found her trembling in a neighbor's living room. They searched Emma's house, but found no sign of anyone. No footprints, no evidence of forced entry, just the lingering fear and the unsettling memory of the knocks that turned Halloween night into a nightmare she'd never forget. Story number 3, The Shadow That Followed Us. On Halloween night in the small, close-knit town of Cold Hollow, Halloween was always a time of celebration. Kids ran through the streets in costumes, laughter echoing through the crisp October air. This year, 13-year-old Elena had dressed up as a vampire, complete with fake blood and a flowing black cape. Her younger brother, Noah, wore a classic ghost costume, and their friend Sam was decked out as a pirate, eye patch and all. Their parents had given them permission to trick or treat until 9, and the trio was determined to make the most of it. Bags already heavy with candy, they decided to hit a few more houses before heading home. As they strolled down Maplewood Avenue, the streetlights cast long, shadowy figures that danced along the pavement. They were approaching an old, vacant-looking house at the end of the street when Sam stopped. "Hey, did you see that?" he whispered, pointing to a figure standing by the oak tree across the road. Elena squinted into the shadows and saw him, a man in a dark suit, wearing a cracked porcelain mask, the kind you'd see at a masquerade ball. The mask's painted grin seemed to mock them. "He's probably just someone trying to scare us," Elena said. Though her voice wavered, Noah clung to her cape, his small hand trembling. The figure didn't move, and his silence was unnerving. They exchanged uneasy glances and decided to skip the house, walking quickly to the next street. But as they rounded the corner, Elena glanced back. The masked man was following them, his pace slow and deliberate. He lingered just far enough behind to keep them on edge. "Okay, this is seriously creepy," Sam muttered, adjusting his eye patch nervously. Elena's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm for Noah's sake. "Let's head to the Johnson's house," she suggested. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson always hosted a massive Halloween party, and the yard was filled with people. Safety in numbers, she reasoned. They sped up, practically dragging Noah along. When they reached the Johnson's house, Elena breathed a sigh of relief. Kids and parents crowded the yard. Music blared from speakers, and the smell of caramel apples filled the air. For a moment, they felt safe. But then, Elena turned around and saw the masked man standing at the edge of the yard, just outside the glow of the party lights. He tilted his head, as if amused by their fear. Elena's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't a prank anymore. "Stay here," she whispered to Noah and Sam, her voice shaking. She approached Mr. Johnson, a burly man dressed as Frankenstein. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "There's a man following us. He's wearing a mask and he won't leave us alone." Mr. Johnson's jovial expression hardened. "Stay with the group," he instructed. He walked toward the masked man, but as soon as he did, the figure melted into the shadows, vanishing without a sound. The rest of the night was a blur. The police were called, but they found nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Yet the fear lingered, clinging to Elena's skin like a cold mist. For days after, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every Halloween since, she'd remember the masked man who followed them through Cold Hollow, a silent shadow that turned a night of fun into a haunting memory. Story number 4, The Terrifying Jeep That Almost Took Us Halloween Night in the bustling town of Edgewater was always full of excitement. Streets lined with pumpkins, the smell of autumn leaves in the air, and the laughter of kids running from house to house, collecting their sugary spoils. 14-year-old Maya and her best friend Lisa had planned this night for weeks. Dressed as a witch and a werewolf, the two friends were ready for a night they'd never forget. Little did they know, this Halloween would haunt them forever. They had filled their candy bags quickly and decided to venture a bit further from their usual trick-or-treating route into the quieter part of town where the houses were more spaced out. As they walked down Birchwood Lane, a narrow street with tall, shadowy trees, the festive energy seemed to thin out. The streetlights flickered, and an unsettling quiet wrapped around them. Maya laughed nervously. "Okay, maybe we should turn back," she suggested, her voice wavering. Lisa, always the fearless one, shook her head. "Just one more block," she urged. "I bet the houses over there have the best candy." Before Maya could protest, the quiet was shattered by the low rumble of an engine. A faded green Jeep rolled up beside them, its windows tinted so dark that they couldn't see the people inside. The Jeep slowed, matching their pace. Maya and Lisa exchanged worried glances, their unease growing with every second. The passenger window rolled down with a mechanical hiss. A man's voice called out, "Hey girls, need a ride somewhere?" His tone was disturbingly cheerful, and Maya's stomach twisted with dread. She couldn't see the man's face clearly, but she could make out the shadow of a baseball cap and a sinister grin. "No, thank you," Lisa replied, trying to sound brave, but her voice cracked. The Jeep didn't drive away. Instead, it inched closer. Maya's hand clutched Lisa's, their candy bags forgotten. The man in the Jeep laughed. "Come on, it's not safe out here," he said, and the doors clicked open. Another man, burly and wearing a ski mask, stepped halfway out of the back seat, his eyes cold and calculating. "Run!" Maya screamed, and the two friends bolted down the street, their legs pumped with adrenaline, feet pounding against the pavement as they weaved through front lawns and leapt over hedges. The Jeep roared behind them, tires screeching as it followed. Heart racing, Maya spotted a house with its porch light still on. "There," she shouted, dragging Lisa up the driveway. They burst onto the porch, pounding on the front door. An elderly woman opened it, her eyes widening at the sight of two terrified teenagers. "What's going on?" she asked, but Maya and Lisa could only point back toward the street. The Jeep had stopped at the end of the driveway. For a moment, it just sat there, the engine idling, as if considering its next move. Then, without warning, it sped off into the night, vanishing around the corner. The woman ushered them inside and called the police, who arrived minutes later. But by then, the Jeep was long gone, leaving behind only the echo of its engine and the terror it had caused. Maya and Lisa never ventured to that part of town again, and every Halloween since, they couldn't help but remember the green Jeep and the men who almost took them away. The fear lingered, a haunting reminder that the scariest monsters don't always wear masks. Make sure to subscribe for more terrifying stories and hit the bell icon to never miss an update. Don't forget to like, comment, and share these stories with your friends to keep the spooky spirit alive.